Good evening, everyone. I am Gina Osterloh, Assistant Professor in the Art Department. And tonight, we are here to welcome Zoe Leonard. Zoe Leonard's Artist Talk this evening is co-sponsored by the Department of Art, the Living Culture Initiative, the Cultural Events Committee, and the Wexner Center for the Arts. We would particularly like to thank Alana Ryder, Bruce Bartow, and all of the staff here at the Wexner. Thank you, Ann Hamilton and Joe E. Tang, curator of the Beeler Gallery at CCAD, for bringing Zoe Leonard here tonight, and a special welcome to Johanna Burton, the new Wexner Center director who begins tomorrow. First, some announcements, some business. After Zoe's talk, Zoe Leonard will take a couple of questions and then join us afterwards in the bookstore. We have quite a packed next 2 to 3 days. Tomorrow, Friday, March 1st, from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., Jared Thorne, professor and phenomenal colleague in the art department, has the reception of his solo exhibition, 26 Planned Parenthoods, at Contemporary Art Matters Gallery. The gallery is located at 243 North 5th Street in the Factory Gallery, Suite 110. Saturday, March 2nd, the Ohio State University MFA Thesis Exhibition has the reception from 5 to 7 at Urban Art Space. It's truly an immersive and visually stunning MFA exhibition. I hope everyone here can attend. In the daytime, also Saturday, March 2nd, from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. at the Columbus College of Art and Design's Beeler Gallery is the symposium for the exhibition and project Arms Ache Abad Aeon, Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episala, Zoe Leonard, Carrie Yamaoka, Fierce Pussy Amplified. The exhibition focuses on the individual art practices of the 4 original core members of the queer art collective Fierce Pussy, which Zoe Leonard is a part of. The symposium will have all 4 artists' participation atualongside art historian Jill Cassad, writer Elizabeth Lebovici, Greg Bordovitz, as well as Associate Curator of Media and Performance Art at MoMA, Thomas J. Lax, and more. The symposium is organized by Beeler Gallery Director Joe E. Tang, and the exhibition is curated by Joey and co-organized with Ian Ruffino, Marla Roddy, and is now in its 4th chapter. It ends on March 17th, and Chapter 5 of Fierce Pussy Amplified will travel to the Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, in September. Of course, it's impossible to list all of Zoe Leonard's exhibitions, projects, and riveting wheat paste posters. Zoe Leonard is a dedicated activist and political organizer. Since the 1980s, Zoe Leonard has been a force in ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. In 1990, Zoe was part of a collective that published the book Women, AIDS, and Activism. And in 1991, Zoe Leonard, along with many other women, founded the collective Fierce Pussy. Zoe Leonard's exhibition record includes recent retrospectives at the Whitney Museum of Art and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, solo exhibitions at Hauser and Wirth Los Angeles, the 2007 Documenta 12, which I just wanted to mention because that was the first time I was in physical presence of your work, and to note the 2007 presentation of Analog here at the Wexner Center for the Arts. I am thrilled to introduce Zoe Leonard this evening for many reasons, but in particular, her dedicated work as an activist, coupled with her ability to create the conditions for deliberative looking, have been a profound influence. I am thinking of her larger-than-human-sized wheat paste poster, first created in 1992 and then installed for the High Line in New York City in 2016, that includes the text, "I want a dyke for president. I want a person with AIDS for president. I want someone with no health insurance. I want a president that had an abortion at 16. And I want a president who isn't the lesser of two evils. I want a president who lost their last lover to AIDS." to a line of blue suitcases and black and white silver gelatin photographs in a museum. The pared down multiple views of an airplane wing, the sun, a tree pressing against and into a chain link fence. A type of looking that is familiar, yet poignant and intentional, insistent upon a non-authoritative position in the world. When encountering Zoe Leonard's work at her retrospective at the Whitney last year, and again in the Fierce Pussy Amplified exhibition at the Beeler, I ask myself, how does a large series or a single photograph hold a wall, activate my field of vision, interpolate me, ask me to get closer, and in the large open space of the museum, through the process of looking, simultaneously feel a tremendous sense of loss and like floating. All of us gathered together this evening share a certain nuanced yet common context of viewing. In a recent online interview between Joey Tang and Malu Mazzaroto, the Wexner's Public and University Programs intern, Joey spoke about our context and conditions of looking within art and art education. In the interview, Joey Tang reminds us this evening, albeit for a brief and fleeting moment together, to consider this framework of time and space without an end goal, to begin with a framework of freedom. And this context of viewing, one that deliberately resists an authoritative stance, deeply echoes the field of vision that Zoe Leonard's photographs, sculptures, and installations activate. Please welcome Zoe Leonard.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that really beautiful and very warm introduction. I really appreciate it. It was very touching. Hi. It's really, really great to be here. We've been joking about glasses. There's people here that I've known for a really long time before we needed glasses. So I need one pair to see you guys and then a different pair for here, so I'm just gonna... well, thank you all for being, hello. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's really, really great to be here, or rather to be back here. I did a residency here at the Wexner Center about 15 years ago that resulted in an exhibition about 12 some years ago. And so I wanted to start, so it's really great to be back here. First, I want to thank you, Anne, for the generous invitation. Today's really been a long time coming. Anne and I met before even that residency, and when I came for the residency, Anne was like, yeah, come do a talk when the exhibition happens. For one reason or another, it didn't happen then. Every couple of years, we would email and be like, how about this year? And it never worked, and then here we are. So thank you, Anne, for being such a wonderful colleague and comrade and partner in crime. Sherry Gelden, thank you. As I was preparing my scribble of notes, it kind of hit me, like Sherry was the director when I did my residency and the exhibition, and it was your generosity and the rigorousness of your engagement with me and my work that made it possible for me to complete Analog, which was a project of some 10 years. And we did a lot of different things together over my years of engagement here, and there's something incredibly, I'm honored to be here right now in this moment of transition and to celebrate you and all that you've brought to the Wexner, and to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the support you've offered me and my work. So thank you, Sherry. And Johanna, who knew? When we set the dates for this, we also didn't know there would be a new director and that it would be Johanna. And so I'm equally thrilled by that amazing coincidence of being here during this transition, with Johanna stepping into her new position as director. Congratulations to you, Johanna, for taking up the reins here. And congratulations to the Wexner for being smart enough to hire Johanna. The intelligence and foresight that shows is no small thing. Johanna's a brilliant thinker and writer and curator and historian, and also just a really great person. So I'm like, I get to be here with both of you. I'm like best of both worlds. And lastly, I want to thank Joey Tang. Joey, are you here? Hey, hi, Joey. Thank you, Joey, for bringing me here, bringing us here, for curating Arms Ache Avid Aeon at the Beeler. It's a show of 4 people, but 5 artists. The 4 artists and then our collective project together, Fierce Pussy. The work that we've done together. And the exhibition is, it's been really incredible watching what Joey has done and how he's worked with the collective, kind of pulling out and unpacking these intersecting conversations between us. And it's this kind of your sensitive and thoughtful but incredibly experimental approach to the show that's been kind of unlike any other I know of, actually. And so thanks for sort of bringing us back and somehow into the mix here again. And then thanks in advance to Joy and Carrie and Nancy Brody, who are not here tonight, but they'll be here tomorrow. And they are my comrades of some 25 years of collaborating together and being friends. And so we'll be at the symposium this weekend if you want to join us. So you don't usually have to say that much stuff, but today really called for it. So this is kind of a little bit of an experiment. I went a little nuts here. Anne can attest to that, because while she was waiting for me to come downstairs, I was in my hotel room, like, adding more shit to the PowerPoint, being like, yeah. So one tends to think of exhibitions as something that is fixed or permanent, or that something has been arrived at and becomes static. About 6 years ago, I was invited to do a retrospective. And that very notion of the retrospective, even the word itself, the looking back, is a notion that something is finished and that you can look back at it from that position of it being finished. And although I accepted the invitation, I didn't want to conform to that. Oh, hey, Danny. I didn't want to conform to that rigid structure. I really wanted the show to be a kind of living and, oh, hi, Laura. Wow, this is really nice. All right, I'm going to stop with that. I'll be like, hi, over here. I wanted to make something that felt like where it feels like I am in my work, which is in the middle of it, in the mix of it, as a working artist, with some things behind me and some things in front, and with a set of concerns that are always shifting, but rather than creating a definitive narrative, I really wanted the opportunity to have an exhibition enact or embody the principles or ideas that are in the work itself, to see if I could make that as an experience. So with a talk, I usually try to talk about the newest body of work, and I realized that like my newest body of work is this retrospective. And can we think about this exhibition as an artwork? So I'm going to walk you through the exhibition kind of as if it were my studio, which it kind of was. Although there were a lot of other people in there with me, because making an exhibition is a group experience. Yeah, and then if you have questions about individual bodies of work or whatever, we can get to all of that afterwards. But, oh boy, glasses. Yeah. So the retrospective it went to two venues. It was generated by MoCA in LA, but it actually opened in New York first. So we'll start there. Oh, I forgot to ask how to do this. Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah, we had a little shenanigans earlier. Even the word retrospective, well, there'd also been the size thing. I'd been offered the whole Geffen building, which is like 26,000 square feet. And then at some point they decided to divide the building and I had 12,000 square feet. And I was like, I'm not gonna pack a retrospective into half the space. How can I make this work for me? How can I use this restriction to my advantage? And I thought about the word retrospective and what's implied in it. And I thought, well, actually maybe the word is survey. And the word survey is an interesting word because it can mean a survey show, it's a noun, but it's also a verb. It's to survey, to look over something, to look at something. But it's a particular kind of looking. It's not like to behold something. It's not as cold as to examine something. It's a kind of observation that's about wanting to understand. When one surveys a piece of land, surveyors have to have at least 3 different vantage points. When you survey something, it's about relation. This is high because that's low. So everything is dependent on everything else, and the experience you have is relational. So we call the show Survey. I worked with an incredible exhibition designer, Marcos Corrales, who came in from Madrid. Another fluke of timing meant that there wasn't an exhibition designer at the Whitney at that particular moment, and Marcos came in and did the architecture with me, and it was an unbelievable colleague, and yeah, he's amazing. So the show begins there with the kind of the idea of a life, of an accumulation of a life of experience. This blue suitcase piece is called 1961, and that's the year of my birth, hence the glasses. I added, it's an ongoing work. It's actually in the collection of the Guggenheim now, but every year on the week after my birthday, we send them up another blue suitcase and they add it. So it's a work that defies all the principles of the staticness of a museum collection, because it's the dimensions of it change every year, the number of suitcases of it change every year. You have to have a conversation with the registrar. They have to deal with a living person every year. And I have to find a new blue suitcase and get it to them. A really nice thing in the last few years is that friends have started giving me blue suitcases, so I don't have to like skulk around the Salvation Army anymore. But there's something about both this idea of accumulation and seriality and the idea of portraiture or autobiography that felt like the right sort of starting point for this show. And on the walls here, there are a bunch of these early aerial photographs from mostly the early 90s. Also in the first room, there's a window. It's a pretty short view, but it felt really important to me that the first room have an aperture, that the show was somehow in the world and of the world and in relation to the world, and not completely confined by the white cube. as we move along through this, you'll see that the sort of defining feature of this fifth floor space is a huge view to the west, a curtain wall that's 60 feet wide and 17 feet tall that overlooks the Hudson River. So that feature actually became the starting point for every other decision that I made about the checklist and the placement. And I didn't make all those alone. Bennett Simpson from MoCA was involved, and Elizabeth Sherman from the Whitney was there till like midnight on the last night working with me. She was really, really amazing. So in trying to figure out how to thin down what I was going to show, I was like, well, what do you choose? Like, typically with a lot of retrospectives, there's a phrase you'll often notice in artist bios where it'll say, so-and-so was the subject of a retrospective exhibition. And I was like, oh no. I'm not going to be the subject of your retrospective exhibition. After I'm dead, please, that would be wonderful. I would love that. Please do that show. But while I'm living, I don't want to be the subject of my retrospective. I want to make a show that's actually entangled in my practice, that's part of my practice. So I was like, so how do you choose the best work? By my age, Anne and I were talking about this as we were driving from the airport. Like, you made a lot of work by now. I mean, I have anyways. How do you choose? What's the best work, the greatest hits, the things that are best known? How do you winnow it down? I wanted the rooms to feel really spacious, not just for aesthetics, but because I wanted to leave room for the viewer. I really wanted there to be room for you. So I was like, less might be more, but how do I edit it? And so I started with that view out the western window to the Hudson and thought about the history. Like, where are we? We're in New York City. We're looking at the Hudson. There's a kind of history in art history around the Hudson and Hudson River. It's also a working river. There are all kinds of questions of territory and Native American land rights, the Lanai Lenape. There are questions of industry. There's that part of New York, of Manhattan, is one of the oldest parts of the city. And then you're also in this brand new Renzo Piano building that really announces itself with this tremendously ambitious curtain wall overlooking the window, overlooking the river. The other thing, I learned a lot about a lot of technical, like kind of nerdy stuff about what it means to have an exhibition, things like your light levels, your foot candles. I learned so much about foot candles. So in a room that has an open window, this is a real Wexner thing too. Oh my God, the foot candles and that glass wall. I'm sure I can tell you about that. It's going to be really interesting, Johanna. Get used to it. Condensation, sun, whatever. So if you want to show works on paper in a room that has a lot of sun, you sort of have a problem, especially if you're trying to borrow work. So this magnificent window, I'm going to move, no, I'm not, is both the biggest advantage to the space because it's incredibly beautiful, but it also lets in a tremendous amount of light, and it meant that I couldn't show any loans in that room unless I wanted to build it out, scrim it, gel it, cover it. And I didn't want that. I wanted the view, but so I came up with all of these solutions, but that sort of became my starting point, and I worked backwards from the window to this entrance. So from this first room, so this window here also kind of echoes the window that you get later. So at the beginning and the end of the exhibition, you're always met with the outside world somehow. This second room here deals with works that I've made that have to do with museum display and with hierarchies that are rendered through museum display, and how a lot of these are early works, mostly from the 80s and late 80s and early 90s, that have to do with kind of how sexism and racism and a lot of notions around human value are kind of built into how museums present work or how they present objects. So after that first room of sort of presenting the idea of the biography or the survey and the ideas of mapping and self, I moved into this room that was about the museum. That's where you are, you're in a museum. These are some early wax anatomical photographs from I shot in Europe in the early 90s. On that far wall is a piece called Preserved Head of a Bearded Woman. I'll talk about that more later. In the case in the middle is a large-scale work called the Faye Richards Photo Archive, and that's a work that really deals, it's a fictional archive, and we can also talk about that more later. So introducing those ideas. Oh, sorry, okay. There we go. So then from that room, you have a choice of two different kinds of circulation. The first one takes you down a long hallway that takes you all the way to the end and brings you into the room with the river view. So this is a piece from the mid-90s that I made as a commission for Dia Beacon, composed of some 4,000 postcards of Niagara Falls that kind of works as it toggles between being a kind of map or a scroll and kind of toggles between being abstract and being representational. All the grids of postcards, these are all found postcards, I organize them in grids, not just like with like, but by vantage point, like where, not in terms of what you're looking at, but in terms of where the photographer was located when they took the photograph, like what's the vantage point onto the subject. So I used an aerial photograph of Niagara Falls, and I used it as a guide and made this sort of horizon line that was like as if you took the curve of that and like snapped it into a straight line. That's like the water line and the horizon line. So if the photographer was below the falls, the postcard went above that horizon line, and if the photographer was standing on top of the falls and one of the viewing points, the postcard was below. So to introduce this idea of looking as a kind of, as a form of mapping, but I need a better word for it because mapping carries that authority. It's a kind of question of subjectivity. It's a question of that all looking and all forms of representation have their subject as part of it, but then the position of the person making the artwork or the position of the person looking. So it's always, there's always more than one thing going on. And in a lot of conversations about photography, it's like it's with a subject. Oh, it's a pepper. Oh, it's a naked person. Oh, people will describe what the picture is of. And I want us to really think about the other side of it, which is where's the picture taken from? And that leads to this bigger question, I think, of not just where is it from physically, where is it from socially, politically, emotionally? Your point of view is expressed through everything you say, everything you do, and certainly every picture you take. And it informs the way the subject is represented. So breaking that down in really simple photographic terms was kind of the goal of this. And this was also, it's a pretty big work. I did a slightly actually compressed version of it here. It's 100 feet long here and 17 feet tall. So I wanted to meet also Renzo Piano's kind of the monumentality of his curtain window onto the river. I kind of wanted to meet it with another kind of epic scale, but this epic can all be like basically packed into a box. It's postcards. So there's a great economy of means here. If you take the other, like if you take this to the right, there is a set of dye transfer prints from the piece Analog, which I worked on while I was in Sherry's hair for 2 years. Yeah, we can talk about that more. And then right behind that is an installation of a work called Strange Fruit, which is about 360, 70 some odd pieces of like fruit peels that have been sewn, that I sewed back together and are scattered on the floor. It's one work. And I made it, I think, between 90 and 95. So I was working on this in sort of one can't say the height of the AIDS crisis because we're still very much in the middle of the AIDS crisis, but at a moment before there were any available medications for anyone. Now there are available medications for people who can afford them and who have access to them, but there was a moment when getting a diagnosis of being HIV positive was a short death sentence. So this work really was a work of mourning. Back to there. We worked a lot with the sight lines in making the show. This sight line through, what's actually on that in the doorway is I Want a President that you just read a part of. I decided that everyone felt it had to be in the show, but I wanted it to have a kind of lower key presence. So instead of making posters or doing a billboard or making a stack or doing any of these things to make it bigger, I made I didn't have the original typewritten one anymore, but I had a scan, and so we made a facsimile of my original typewritten piece and just showed it at 8.5 by 11, just like a little piece of onion skin typewriter paper on the wall. And so it's kind of, you see it from the very first room. It's always there, but you really don't know what it is until you get right up on it. And then it's kind of both present throughout the exhibition, but kind of hiding in plain sight in some way. And it's in a room with a couple of, another one of these suitcase stack pieces, a portrait, and a number of works that have to do with, I think with ideas of kind of compression and closure and struggle, and that in some ways the human figure sort of comes out in the suitcase stack, and then in this smaller stack piece of books. This work is called Tipping Point, and it's 53 copies of the first edition of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. I made it in 2016. And so there had just been a spate of police murdering young, unarmed black men, black people. This is a book that has been really important to me for most of my life. I'd been playing around with it in the studio for years, probably 8 or 9 years. I've made now a number of book stack pieces, some of them that sort of deal with photography and some of them that deal with other kinds of ideas. But this one was the first one to resolve, and I think it resolved under this kind of social pressure of what was happening, and something about the recursiveness of that title, The Fire Next Time. But the essay that's in there are two essays, and one of them is the letter that Baldwin wrote to his nephew. It's a really, really extraordinary read. If we had the time, I would just read it to you now. But the repetition, and repetition is something that I use a lot in the work, a repetition or seriality, in this particular case was used as the kind of repeating of, like, how many times does this have to be said, and when does one reach the tipping point? This book has been continuously in print since it was first published in, I think it was 1963. So that's it, sort of that book stack, and then the suitcase stack are kind of in this room with a number of these like closed off or wall photographs of closed up walls and windows, and then groups of these photographs of, do I have any images of that? No. Of like trees and fences, trees growing through fences. So there was a kind of idea of both compression and of resistance or pushing back, and the idea of the voice, the human voice. So it was the I Want a President and this that sort of gave that. From there, you can see that the hallway is, you're kind of following as you move through the exhibition this way. The hallway with UCIM here is parallel to all of the other galleries, so you can see it through every other doorway, and it kind of formed a baseline to the whole show. And this is at the end of the piece, and then you look into this last room, which has this view. And I wanted to do something, so there was something about showing UCIM here, after all, which is the name of the big postcard piece, that I wanted, there's something in this room at the Whitney where the view is so magnificent that it's always going to be more interesting than anything you put in the room. So if you don't close it or scrim it or build out in front of it or somehow mitigate it, you lose all the energy of your show, because it's just always better to look at like moving water and boats and people and its life and the sun and the clouds, and sunset is facing west, you get these amazing sunsets. And I somehow wanted to see, like, is it possible to get all that energy of that view but actually make it part of my show? Like, could I get a little traction out of the view rather than losing viewers? Because you often get to the end of a show at the Whitney, and sometimes this room is set up with like some couches as a reading room, or a lot of times they build out in front of it to close off the view. So I was like, how can I get the view but make it work for my work, for the show? So I came up with this book piece, which was very like another one that I had made before. It's called How to Take Good Pictures, and it's some 1,300 copies of a manual called How to Take Good Pictures that has been in print since around 1911, and they're stacked each printing, and it was in print, physically in print, until the mid-90s. So it formed a kind of landscape, and at one point we'd drawn it out from the other wall, but I realized you kind of had to see it first, and so that you would come off the postcards that were already asking you to kind of look up and down and think about how perception is constructed. Like, how is any view of something actually a construction rather than a given? So to come off of that and then to hit this and to have something between you and that view that you kind of have to deal with and that you have to kind of walk around. Of course, it's not as magnificent of the view, but it brings you back to something that's actually really both very humdrum. It's this manual, it's cheaply made, it was widely distributed, but it's also a book that is an instruction manual, how to take good pictures. which over the course of that century maybe meant a lot of different things, like what's a good picture, not only aesthetically, but what's in the picture. Almost all of the covers of this manual had like pictures of like happy families, mostly white, a lot of dogs, a lot of kids, a lot of smiling people with cameras. And so it feels to me, or I interpret this book as not only telling you the aesthetics of don't shoot into the sun, don't overexpose, but also sort of telling you what your life is supposed to look like. Like a good picture is a picture in which you look successful. It's aspirational. It's, this is a kind of post-war aspiration. And the empty space at the end of the gallery beyond this image of it, for me, was also a sort of indication of how that continues now with, we all have our phone in our pocket and where people post on social media. And so this kind of question of how we use, how amateur photography, how vernacular photography is such a part and parcel of our everyday life. And it's a really complex thing. Like it's great, but it also has really definitive political meaning, I think, like how you choose to represent yourself in the world. So that was the end of it here. Oh, except, yeah. Elizabeth Sherman and I kind of located these, how long have I been talking? My phone kind of, where am I at? About 40 minutes. Oh, okay, good. This said like an hour and 8 and 9 minutes, and I was like, oh, that's not good. So Elizabeth Sherman, the curator I was working with at the Whitney, we'd identified these spaces throughout the new Whitney building, the piano building. He had this idea where in a number of the workspaces, there would be a glass wall between the workspace and the circulation spaces for the general public that were moving around. So there are 8 points through the building where you can look in on a conference room, an office, a library, like places you can't enter, but you can see people working. And so it's this kind of membrane between front of house and back of house, between what the public is encouraged to look at and all the dirty little secrets that happen back of house at every museum. It's also a really weird proposal in terms of labor, I think. We certainly don't have a glass wall into the director's office, for instance. So whose labor can we look at? It's a really interesting feature. Piano speaks of it as a kind of transparency, and it is a kind of transparency, but it's also a kind of I don't know, I felt challenged by these spaces. I was very intrigued by them and what they did. And we'd had a number of different ideas of how to use them, and I would go way over time if we talked about all of those. But I sort of came up with this idea that I wanted to also situate my show within the framework of the museum and somehow make that evident. The art historian Linda Nochlin had died that fall. Ironically, I think the week after the Harvey Weinstein story broke. Many of you may know her work, some of you might not. She was an art historian. She's like a Courbet scholar, a very, very highly respected art historian. Her most famous or infamous essay is one called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Which that sentence still stings today, I think, not because there aren't, but because there's, maybe I'm the generation that's actually getting to cut my teeth a little bit more, there's a little more space. But the glass ceiling is so present. what women artists are offered. I'm sure this is also true for women curators, women directors, women writers, whatever, every position. It holds true in the art world. It's not just a kind of wage gap in other fields. So something, what our shows are, it's smaller budget, you're expected to be more flexible on your timeline and what you want to do, and if you're not flexible, then you're really difficult to work with, and, it's just like the difficult woman artist is like this figure that, like, I embody, because, what else are you going to do, it's something that's put on you. It's almost like it's like ridiculous sometimes. Like a male artist will ask for something really impossible, and it'll be like, oh my God, it's so great. He knows exactly what he wants. So terrible. It's like, but he's just a genius. And when a woman is like, no, I want it this way, it's like, oh my God, she's so demanding. She's so difficult. It's something we all kind of cope with. I'm sure. It's not news. But so Elizabeth Sherman and I had this idea. So we reread that essay, and I cut it up into pieces and worked on like editing the text, and then we silk screened these excerpts of it throughout the building wherever there was a kind of portal between the back of house and front of house circulation spaces. So this is a conference room where there are often like meetings going on, and there's this text floating above their heads talking about those who have privileges inevitably hold on to them and hold tight no matter how marginal the advantage involved, until compelled to bow to superior power of one sort or another. What's interesting about her essay too, is written in, I think in 71 or 72, I don't recall right now, but that it was literally intersectional before that term was used. She actually makes the connection in the essay to the devalued labor of African Americans. She really kind of she actually puts a framework within her feminist read of art history, and specifically the institutions of universities, libraries, the academy and the museum, and she kind of pulls it apart in an intersectional way. It's a problematic essay in some ways. It's dated, but it almost hurt how like on point it was after all these years. I was like, God damn it, it still works. So there was this uncomfortable set of situations that happened, of just drawing one's attention to the invisible labor behind the glass doors, and it also, so it became both a framework for my show to sit inside, and a kind of tale or something that led in or out. And there was no big sign like Zoe Leonard's. It was called Homage. There were small labels, but there wasn't a lot of like, oh, this way, or this is part of that show. We didn't put up a bunch of signage. I kind of wanted it to be like a stealth thing that you would find or not find, and people might be a little thrown by that. The Whitney was a little reluctant. They wanted a lot more signage, and they wanted me to say that she was a feminist, and I was just like, let's just see how this percolates out. What will people get from this? So these are some of the just places throughout. And this is just some this is what I was putting in my fit right before you arrived. I was like, oh, some of this process of just like us working on it and silk screening it. And this particular one, what if Picasso had been born a girl? We put in their education center where they do a lot of programming with school kids. And there's me and Elizabeth after the end of a very long day. So is this like boring? Is this like working at all? So we can go go through this side a lot faster, but the show in LA was a completely different animal. There was a lot of pressure, like a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous amount of pressure to deliver the exact same show in two places, because that's how they're supposed to work, that's what it is. There was also a tremendous amount of pressure to like include a lot more work than what I thought would look good, because they wanted to bill it as a retrospective, they being the two institutions, but I didn't feel that there was enough space to show that much work, and I didn't really want to do it that way. So after a lot of wrangling, the show at MoCA is really different than the one in New York. It's basically a completely different show. And I took as my starting point here almost the opposite of the this big western view overlooking the Hudson with all of that history and all of that picture-ness. The Geffen is an old warehouse. It has a wooden ceiling. It's completely exposed structurally. You see like all the beams, and there's all this sort of like metal and wood framework up above you. There are no apertures to the outside. There are no windows. There are no exterior views. So I decided to take a different line through the work and think about structure and internal structures and kind of sort of internal and emotional configurations, and build the show back from this building. So the centerpiece of this is basically this one sculpture that we'll get to in a little bit, of a reconstructed tree. But it starts with the same introduction here with the suitcase and a much smaller selection of the aerials. And then survey, that's the title of this particular work. It's not the same piece as the one that's on the wall. This is actually almost twice as many postcards, believe it or not. And that's my work table from the studio. It was my postcard sorting table, and eventually it became an artwork. So the ideas of kind of mapping and the self in the first room, and then the viewpoint onto the mirror and into the museum set of considerations, museum, history, the academy. And this room had both mirrors in it, so they sort of did this like, they were hung kitty corner from each other. The ceiling is much lower in this gallery and the next 4 galleries. You go from this like soaring, 40-foot plus ceiling to this like 9.5-foot ceiling. So at the Whitney, there had been like a low entrance that Marcos had designed, and then you came into this really big space and had a sense of expanse. Here you begin with the expanse, and you kind of go into, like the people that work at the museum literally call this space the bunker. So again, placing the figure inside the museum. Faye Richards. Again, working with viewpoints, what you see from one room to the next. So this is a kind of a reconfiguration of the urban landscape room in the other show. With these kind of issues of compression and resistance pushing through the tree and fence work. And then there's a viewpoint into this other body of work that wasn't shown at the Whitney at all, which are these photographs of the sun that I made in the early, mid-2000s. Photographing directly into the sun, and rather than trying to take a good picture, like breaking all of those rules, and really just letting the photographs be glare. So there's a room of those, and you see the tree that anchors the second to final room. But there's a small room off to the side here, still in the bunker. And here there was a series of fruit trees where the leaves had fallen off, but the fruit was still there. Nests, a number of kind of, some of the only work I've ever done where there's not a lot of man-made stuff around. They're kind of in nature. But then you quickly go into another even smaller anteroom where there's a group of 6 hunting photographs from a subsistence hunting camp. So it's in a very small room, really much more tightly hung than the rest of the show. The scale of these photographs, they're actually pretty big. They're kind of almost like 1-to-1 body size. So you're kind of, and that room dead ends, so you have to like walk back out of it and then to the sons. So again, you're in nature, but there's human interaction. And then out into this giant room, probably a 5,000, almost 6,000 square foot room with, again, going back up to the like 40 plus foot high ceilings. The tree is, I think, 37 feet or 38 feet. It's a work from, oh boy, 98, I think, this reconstructed tree. And above the tree there, you see that kind of balcony. There's a kind of mezzanine above the bunker. Like you can see the wall that defines the height of the bunker, and then there's this sort of, this cable, thing that thing so you don't fall over. And that's a whole other space up there. And the tree ended up kind of spanning the 2 spaces and kind of unifying the end of the show with the beginning of the show, unifying the spaces on these 2 different heights. I'm not going to talk about those right now. But there are these enlarged contact sheets of kind of birds circling and among rooftops in New York, and they're very kind of repetitive and a little bit cinematic. And just to give a sense of scale, I put a couple of photographs of us in process installing it. The person standing on the ground there is Jocelyn Davis, who's worked with me for 20-some years. So she was, you probably remember her, she was here when we were working on analog. She did so much thrifting, oh my God. There's just a mad thrifting in this town. We had to buy suitcases to bring home. Maybe that's when the suitcase piece started, I don't know. So there was the connectors of the tree, which were from when they were part of the work from the 90s, but there was a way that it moved into the structure of the building, kind of a piece. And then you go upstairs, and you can still see the tree. And this room has how to take good pictures. And there's a smaller selection of this work in the Whitney overlooking the river, which I probably should have mentioned then. But the photographs on the wall here are all photographs of family snapshots from right after World War II. And the other reason for wanting to put those works with the how to take good pictures in that last room overlooking the Hudson, that's also where you can see Ellis Island from that window at the Whitney, and you can see the Statue of Liberty. It's where ships would come in with immigrants. It's where ships would come in with refugees at the end of the Second World War. It's how my family got here. And so putting these photographs of family photographs in that last room was also a way to kind of indicate or think about what that means now, like what's going on now with immigration. So it's a pretty big body of work. There's maybe 20 works in all. I showed, I think, 4 at the Whitney, just the room, that's what the room would accommodate. But here at MoCA, I was able to show a much larger group that kind of spanned from like the early days of the war through this kind of decade and a half after the war, where members of my family were stateless and displaced and kind of moving around the world looking for a new place to be. And again, often repetition and glare and kind of allowing all these photographic mistakes to come in and indicate the present day, rather than trying to show them as documents, accurate documents of that time. I tried to intervene with them from this moment now and really look at them as objects and look at them in the light of today, look at them in the light of where we are now in terms of our policy with allowing refugees to enter our country. I mean, not we, but people who have the power to determine that, which I guess indirectly we do. This is one work, it's called Crossing the Equator. This series of work, it felt really tricky to begin with these family photographs and just thought, my God, this could get so corny and so awful and so nostalgic and so horrible in like 5 seconds. But for some reason, I really wanted to make this work. And so I developed over a couple of years a kind of language for looking at these old photographs and photographing them, using this kind of staggering and zooming in and zooming out and repeating and going back and forward, switching cameras, switching film. This particular piece was shot on my phone. So rather than trying to create an archive where, with an archive, you try to make all of the viewing conditions consistent, right? Use the same background, use same lighting, you have a copy stand. You're trying to make the whole context regular so that you can look at the anomaly in the object you're ostensibly looking at. The way that I approached these was I kept everything, there was no stability. I kept changing backgrounds and cameras and film and using all of these where the photographic techniques themselves were really patchy and just sort of scattered to kind of get at that experience of displacement. This one's actually really hard to see. I wish I had brought a detail, but this is in New York Harbor, and you can see the Statue of Liberty in the back, and they're clearly on the ferry going to Ellis Island, going to, not Ellis Island, going to look at the Statue of Liberty. And this is, yeah, so that's where we'll close. But that was the sort of closing image, both in the New York show and the show in MoCA. So the two shows, which I've come to think of as a kind of a diptych, they sort of began and then they really diverge and then they sort of come around again, but with a different selection. So I think that's it for the PowerPoint. I don't know, what do we do now? Questions? I think someone, oh yeah, you got it. Yeah.
So I don't know if it's a question. I just have a series of thoughts that maybe you could respond to. I actually went to the show back in March at the Whitney, and it was so overwhelming. Like, I was blown away by how, I can't even put it into words. And I think part of it is because it was shown with Incomplete History of Protest, which was also like a super like whoa show where the museum itself was implicating itself and showing how it was kind of being problematic as an institution. But then I had never heard of you before March of last year. and that's not a bad thing.
That's true
But
for a
when I
lot of
saw
people.
that show, I started looking up everything that I could find about your work because it made me feel something that I can't put into words. And nostalgia is not the word. Maybe desire, I don't know, longing is not the word, but I think that definitely you have to be in the space because the works, when you see them as a slideshow, I think the work is a lot about putting things back into the body. And so being in the space, you actually feel that. And I don't know about the Mocha show, but when you talked about it being different, I can say that it feels different being in that space. So as you were talking, I think some more things became clear that I noticed but that I had questions about. It seems like horizon is important, not only as a aesthetic kind of tool, but also as a concept, like a thing that is not real, but it's a place where we send desire into, like this kind of medium
Horizon,
between
did you
up
say?
and down. Horizon.
Horizon, yeah.
It's like a medium between the up and the down, and you use that a lot in your work, like the wall piece with those different views of the waterfall. I noticed, and I was just like, whoa. But also in the space, I noticed that you were trying to give the viewer several different perspectives so that we could have more experiences of ourselves in some way, which I thought was interesting. I remember looking down on that table, but I remember thinking I feel like God looking down at the planet. I remember thinking that when I was in the space looking at that table of cards, and then they were spread out in a different way. And then walking into that room where you overlook the Hudson, it actually made me feel kind of sad. And I don't know why. I just remember walking into the room and being overwhelmed, and then also looking at the buildings behind the stacks of books and feeling sad. And so I guess I don't even know if I have a question. I feel bad. I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
Okay. No,
I'm
it's
rambling
fine.
because I'm excited because I've been wanting to hear you talk about it, but also, I don't know. I don't know what I want to say, to be honest. Because I wrote down so many random things, but I don't even know what I want to say, so whatever. Place also, things that I'm realizing as I'm thinking about what you just said, but place I wrote down is instrumental for the formation of self, and you use place a lot because in the work that I was attracted to, or most of the work in the survey show, there wasn't ever a person outside of the room where you had the kind of documents of the plastic people, the little anatomical people, but in the other spaces it was just objects, and so experiencing ourself through the experience of relationship to objects, and then thinking about looking to your right and looking out of an airplane window, but I'm the person looking at a photo of an air. I don't know, it was just a weird up and down and to the side, and I felt myself in different ways, and I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that, your thoughts about how do you come into possession of yourself? Is it possible to possess yourself? Because by virtue of being, someone else can see you, taste, touch, smell, so you're the property by virtue of experience, but how do you, do you have thoughts about that when you think about work, when you're, are you trying to talk about yourself? Are you trying to get us to see, to experience
I can answer
ourselves?
that.
I don't know what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say, but okay.
I gotcha. I think I get it. Thank you for that. I think I want to have a conversation with you. I see it as a dialogue. My work is obviously very of me, right? I made it. It's from my point of view. But it's a tool for engagement. It's a tool for conversation. And a lot of the things that you pointed to, a sense of being thrown off kilter from your body and that making you more aware of your body or the experience that you're having. Yeah, thank you, because that is what I'm going for. And it's part of why I tend to hang not super heavy and leave a lot of space for people, but also considering the heights that I hang at and whether things are organized along one line or whether there's a shift in that line. All of the different parameters that could affect how you feel in a room. I'm trying to get there before you do and make it so that there's an experience waiting for you. And I think there's something about how do I say this? Talking about the self. The idea of a portrait that can stably reflect who someone entirely is, or that we can describe completely who a person is or what a thing is, I think is a little bit of a problem as an idea. And so I don't always feel comfortable photographing other people. I don't love that dynamic. I did it a lot when I was really young, but so there aren't a lot of people in the frame. The family photographs there are, but they're mitigated. It's like a photograph of a person. And that's to actually offer up the experience of you being the person in the room. That's exactly what I want to have happen. So that this is a landscape or this is a still life, and you are the person in it. And the other people that you see in the museum, they're in it with you. How you look across the room and you see other people viewing the work. And so scale often plays into it, which is really hard to get in like a PowerPoint. But the scale to the human body, and when works get really monumental so that groups of people can be looking at the same thing, or when they're really tiny and you have to go super close. So yes, I'm always trying to engage you and asking you not to think about me, but to think about, what did you come in here with? Where do you come from? What's on your mind? Does any of this spark something from you? So yeah, sure. There's some here too.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you can talk about your use of, well, in terms of the suitcase work, the use of the ready-made in reference to like a year in your life and how you choose that specific object and like how it relates to you.
Yeah, and the ready-made's definitely there. And there's also something that comes from a really different tradition of sculpture, which is really just kind of repetition and using a regular shape, like a kind of minimalist, like the stacking, the really simple of either stacking or kind of lining up. That's a really minimalist, or that's a problematic term, but for lack of a better one, Judd, Andre, these very simple sculptural additions in a line. And so the desire was to meld these two different things, the very affective, like emotionally potent thing of like a used suitcase that has traveled around the world and obviously belonged to someone, and some of them have name tags. They're from a number of different eras, but something that has that kind of affective quality, and then pairing it with a really super straightforward, just like it's just a line and it's just either a stack or a row. Having those two things play against each other. I'm just committed to the blue suitcase once a year, and I just choose whichever one looks best next to the last one that went there. So I'm not like, this one expresses this year to me, like this was a nasty year, or this was a really gorgeous year, or this was a hard 1940s, valise kind of year. So I'm more just like, I committed to that idea, and I didn't realize it was a self-portrait right away, but I usually mess around in the studio. How many of you guys in here are like art students or like artists? Yeah. So it's a mess, right? You're in your studio and you're trying this and you're trying that, and you think this means that, and then it totally doesn't mean that, and then it's like you do something completely different, and then you end up where you're like, oh, this actually means what that other thing I wanted to make mean. So you're like, somehow with me, with my work, I have to be in it to get it. I can't figure the whole thing out and then be like, here's my brilliant, amazing accomplishment. I kind of have to get in there and be like, okay, I'm interested in this. Why? Get more of it. Take 20,000 photographs. I mean, whoa, Sherry saw, oh my God. They, like, when I was here working on analog, they literally closed off one whole side of the museum. They were renovating because of the glass, whatever. And I had like a 5,000 square foot space. I think I had something like 16,000 photographs in there with me, printed all different sizes. And I was in there for 2 months with like a turtleneck and a hat. And every day just like show up with my cup of coffee, like I still don't know what the hell I'm doing. And just like print them bigger, print them smaller. And yeah, edit these, throw those out. Oh no, reprint all of those. Those are the most important ones. I mean, usually your studio, you have the luxury of it being super private, so no one knows how insane that process is. But here it was like on full display. There are also, it's a museum, so there are cameras. I'm just like, yeah, this is what it looks like. Here it is, expanded. So what was the original question on that? I sort of got a little lost there. Maybe another question?
We have, Zoe, can you take one or two more questions?
Okay.
Hi. I was interested in that sort of underlying conversation going on between the Lyndon Nauckland passages and the Whitney employees and the public, and I just was curious if they stayed up any longer than the duration of your exhibition.
They did, yeah, which was something Elizabeth Sherman kind of advocated for and had to get permission. But yeah, they stayed. I think the show came down early June, and they stayed up at least through the summer. I think through sometime in the fall, maybe early fall. Yeah, so it had a kind of independent life from the show. And I think a lot of people never figured out that it was an artwork by me, which is fine also.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah, this person here has had their hand up for a while.
Hi, thank you for
Hi.
seeing me. Just to listen to you talk, it's really interesting to hear you use words like survey and space and place and perspective, and it sounds very geographical. Can you
Mhm.
talk about that? Maybe is that like an interest of yours, or the kind of reading you do, thinking you do, anything like that?
Yeah, I think, No, that's a kind of a big question. It's a great question. I think a lot of my work ends up in something that could be called landscape. But again, what I'm sort of looking at or trying to engage with is not the landscape in and of itself as a thing apart from the person viewing it. That it's always about these relationships of sight and sight, and that how one moves through a landscape has to do with so many different factors in your life. There's, sort of physical, where you are and how you're moving and how tall you are, like where your eyes are, literally, like, what's your height. But also all the things that inform how you see and how you are, how you feel in the world. And I guess at the end of the day, for me, and it's fine if other people think differently, but for me, all of my work has to do with human experience. It's all about the lived human experience in the world. And so what I'm often trying to elucidate or spark or draw attention to is our kind of registration with the world, and how we're moving through that space, how we see it, how I see it, how you see it, and the kind of the idea that seeing is not just an optical experience, right? Seeing is a whole physical way of being in the world. It's both receptive and it's about projection. You project onto the world as much as you receive the world. It's a deeply engaged way of being. So when I speak about seeing or looking, it's not just about the optical exercise. It's about all the other stuff that's involved. And I think There's a couple of pieces that I've made that are very overtly political. Those have tended to get a lot of attention. Like, I Want a President went like crazy beyond, I mean, I wrote it in 92, but, and that's also fine. But I think there's a politics embedded in a lot of the work in a much subtler way that has to do with questions of subjectivity. Like, literally, how do you see it? And how do you see other people? And it becomes this maybe almost like a triangular thing, like you're looking at this thing, someone else is looking at this thing. Can we look at that together? Can we talk about how we see it differently? Like, can that be a kind of vector for communication, I mean, one of my favorite things in the world, which audio guides have completely destroyed, is overhearing conversations that people have in museums about art. Because it's this like amazing metaphor for what people think about life. One person thinks they know everything about the painting, the other person doesn't. This person's just like, oh, the drapery. But they're having this whole conversation about like the world and what they love and what they don't and what they think they know and what they do know, and they're sharing knowledge. And so there's something in this space that art makes, drawing attention to the visual experience of being in the world, that then for me becomes a whole, metaphor is not quite right, analog isn't quite right. It becomes an alternative space where we consider who we are and who we are to each other and how we're moving through the world and where we got that sense of autonomy or not. It's a way to start thinking about that. That's what it is for me.